The Bride Who Shouldn't Exist. In 1891, a broken woman named Clara Whitmore stepped off a train at a forgotten Wyoming station, still wearing a torn wedding dress. She carried no luggage, only a sealed letter and the weight of 4 stolen years. As the train vanished, townsfolk turned away, sensing scandal and trouble. Then a small boy broke free from the crowd, stared at her face, and said the words that stopped time. "That's my mama." Clara froze. She had been told her child was dead. The past she buried was standing right in front of her. If you want to know how a woman rose from the ashes of betrayal to reclaim everything that was stolen from her, stay with me until the end of this story. And please, hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far Clara's journey reaches across the world. The platform at Sweetwater Station was little more than weathered planks and a sagging overhang that offered no real shelter from the Wyoming wind. Clara Whitmore felt that wind cut through the remains of her wedding dress, a gown that had once been ivory silk, now stained with soot, torn at the hem, and marked by the dirt of 3 state borders. She stepped down from the train car with hands that trembled, not from cold, but from the terrible, fragile hope that had carried her this far. The conductor didn't offer his hand. He simply nodded toward the small cluster of buildings that made up Sweetwater and turned away, as if he had delivered cargo he didn't want to claim responsibility for. The train whistle screamed behind her, and Clara flinched at the sound. For 4 years, every loud noise had made her flinch. She stood alone on the platform, clutching a single sealed envelope against her chest. Inside was a letter she'd written to herself in a Philadelphia asylum, on a night when she'd still believed in miracles. The letter contained 3 things: a name, an address, and a promise she'd made to a child she'd been forced to leave behind. The promise had kept her alive through locked doors and drugged meals. It had kept her silent when doctors asked questions designed to trap her. It had kept her moving when escape seemed impossible. Now, standing in the dust and wind of a town she'd never seen, Clara Whitmore had nothing left but that promise, and the fading hope that it hadn't been built on lies. She looked at the buildings ahead. Sweetwater was smaller than she'd imagined. A main street lined with false-fronted shops, a church with a crooked steeple, a mercantile with faded paint, and a saloon that looked more weary than dangerous. People moved along the wooden sidewalks, but they moved slowly, watching her without pretending not to. Clara knew what they saw. A woman in a ruined wedding dress, no hat, no gloves, no baggage, stepping off a train alone in the middle of nowhere. They saw trouble. They saw scandal. They saw someone who didn't belong. She forced herself to walk forward, her boots, borrowed from a kind woman in Cheyenne, raising small clouds of dust with each step. The platform creaked beneath her weight. Ahead, a group of women had paused outside the mercantile, their faces turning toward her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to cold judgment. Clara kept walking. She had faced worse than their stares. She was halfway across the platform when she heard it, a sound that made her heart stop. A child's voice, high and clear and piercing through the wind. "That's my mama." Clara's legs locked. The world tilted. She turned slowly, afraid that if she moved too quickly, the moment would shatter like glass. A small boy stood at the edge of the platform, maybe 20 feet away. He was 5 years old now, she realized with a sharp pang. He'd grown. His hair was dark like hers, thick and unruly, and his eyes were wide and gray and fixed on her face with an intensity that stole her breath. Behind him stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn work clothes and a hat pulled low against the sun. His hand rested on the boy's shoulder, not gently, but firmly, holding him back. Clara couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at the child she'd been told was dead. The boy tried to step forward. The man's grip tightened. "Daniel," the man said quietly. His voice was rough, like gravel scraped over stone. "Stay put." But the boy, Daniel, her Daniel, didn't listen. He twisted free and ran. Clara dropped to her knees without thinking, without caring that the platform tore at her dress, that people were watching, that the man behind the boy was already moving. Daniel crashed into her arms, small and solid and real, and Clara wrapped herself around him as if she could absorb him back into her body, undo every moment of separation, rewrite 4 years with a single embrace. "Mama," he said again, and the word broke something inside her that had been holding together through sheer will. She was crying. She hadn't cried in the asylum. Crying gave them evidence. She hadn't cried on the train. Crying showed weakness. But here, with her son's heartbeat against her chest, she couldn't stop the tears. "Daniel," she whispered, "my sweet boy, my Daniel." Then hands gripped her shoulders, hard and unforgiving, and pulled her back. Clara gasped as she was lifted to her feet, Daniel torn from her arms. The man, the one who'd been holding the boy, stood between them now, his face carved from anger and something else. Something that looked like fear. "Don't," he said, and the single word carried a warning that made Clara's skin go cold. "Don't you dare." She stared at him, trying to understand, trying to see past the fury in his eyes. He was young, younger than she'd expected, maybe 30. His face was weathered from sun and wind, hard lines around his mouth, but there was something familiar in the shape of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. "Ethan?" she said, the name coming from memory, from a time before everything broke. His expression didn't change. "You don't get to say my name." Daniel was crying now, reaching for her, and the sound cut deeper than any blade. Clara took a step forward. Ethan moved to block her. "Please," Clara said, and she hated how small her voice sounded. "Please, let me—" "Let you what?" Ethan's voice rose, sharp enough to make people stop and turn. "Let you confuse him? Let you break his heart again? I never—" Clara's throat closed. She forced the words out. "I never left him. I was taken." "Taken," Ethan repeated, and the word was bitter as alkali. "That's the story you're going with." "It's the truth." "The truth." He laughed, and it was the ugliest sound Clara had ever heard. "You want to talk about truth? 4 years ago, you disappeared. No letter, no word, no explanation. You left a 2-week-old baby and a man who thought you loved him, and you vanished like you'd never existed." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't leave. My father—" "Your father sent a letter," Ethan cut her off. "Said you'd gone back east, said you'd married someone else, said you wanted nothing to do with us." "That's a lie. Is it?" Ethan shifted Daniel in his arms, and the boy buried his face against his shoulder. "Because you're here now in a wedding dress, Clara. Somebody's wedding dress." She looked down at the ruined gown, at the evidence that condemned her. "It's not what you think." "I don't care what it is." Ethan's voice dropped, became something colder than anger. "You gave up the right to explanations when you left. You gave up the right to him. He's my son. He's my son." The words came out like a vow. "I raised him. I fed him. I walked the floor with him every night when he cried for someone who wasn't coming back. He's mine, Clara. You're just a stranger in a dirty dress." The crowd had grown. Clara could feel their eyes, their judgment, their hunger for scandal. She didn't care. She focused on Ethan, on the man who stood between her and everything that mattered. "I never wanted to leave," she said, and each word cost her. "I was locked away, drugged, threatened. They told me he was dead, Ethan. They told me you both were dead." Something flickered in his eyes, doubt maybe, or memory, but it died as quickly as it appeared. "Convenient story," he said. "Hard to prove." Clara reached into her bodice and pulled out the sealed envelope. Her hand shook as she held it out. "This is a letter I wrote to myself. It has Daniel's name, your name, this address. I wrote it 2 years ago when I still believed I'd find you." Ethan didn't take the letter. He stared at it like it might be poison. 2 years, he repeated. "But you're here now. Why now?" "Because I escaped." "From what?" "From the place my father put me." Clara's voice cracked. "From the asylum." The word fell like a stone into water. The crowd shifted. Someone whispered. Ethan's face hardened. "You're telling me you've been in an asylum," he said slowly, "and you think I'm going to let you near my son?" "Our son." "No." Ethan stepped back, holding Daniel tighter. "Not anymore. Whatever happened to you, whatever you think happened, it doesn't change the fact that you're not his mother. Not in any way that matters." I am his mother. Clara's voice rose, desperate now. I carried him. I gave birth to him. I loved him before I ever saw his face. You can't take that from me. I'm not taking anything. You gave it away. I didn't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Clara. Ethan turned, started walking away. Daniel twisted in his arms, reaching back toward her, crying her name in a voice that would haunt her forever. Clara moved to follow. A hand caught her arm. Sheriff Dawson, a man with gray hair and tired eyes who'd been watching from the edge of the crowd. Best let them go, miss, he said quietly. He's my son, Clara said, and she didn't care that her voice broke, that people were staring, that she was making a scene. That's my son. Maybe so, the sheriff said, but right now you're a stranger causing a disturbance. You want to sort this out, you do it legal and proper. Not here. Not like this. Clara watched Ethan disappear around the corner of the Mercantile, Daniel's cries fading into the distance. The strength that had carried her across 3 states drained away, leaving her hollow. I don't know how to do it legal and proper, she whispered. The sheriff sighed. You got family here? Someone who can vouch for you? Clara shook her head. Money? $17. Place to stay? No. The sheriff looked at her for a long moment, his eyes moving from her ruined dress to her tear-stained face to the letter still clutched in her hand. Clara saw him making calculations, weighing trouble against compassion. There's a boarding house, he finally said. Mrs. Kowalski runs it. She's got a room, and she doesn't ask too many questions. But Clara, he waited until she met his eyes. This town is small. People talk. You want any chance with that boy, you're going to need more than tears and a story. You understand? Clara nodded, though she didn't understand anything except that her son was alive and didn't know her. Thank you, she managed. The sheriff tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her alone on the platform. The crowd had dispersed, returning to their business with the satisfied air of people who'd witnessed good drama. Clara stood in the dust and wind, still holding the unopened letter, still wearing the wedding dress that wasn't hers. She had nothing. No home, no friends, no proof, no rights. But Daniel was alive. That fact, that single impossible truth, was enough to build on. Clara picked up her skirts and started walking toward the boarding house, toward whatever came next, toward the long road of proving she was who she claimed to be. The afternoon sun beat down on her shoulders, and somewhere in this small Wyoming town, her son was crying for a mother he'd been taught to forget. She would not forget him. Not again. Not ever. Even if it took the rest of her life, she would find a way back to him. Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house sat at the end of Main Street, a narrow 2-story building with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged in the middle. Clara climbed the steps with legs that felt like lead, each movement requiring conscious effort. The door was open, and through the screen she could smell bread baking and hear the sound of someone humming. She knocked. The humming stopped. A woman appeared in the doorway, short, round, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She looked Clara up and down, taking in the ruined wedding dress, the dust-covered boots, the tear-stained face. "Sheriff sent you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. He said you might have a room." Mrs. Kowalski pushed open the screen door. "I have a room. Question is whether you can pay for it." "I have $17. Room's $3 a week. Includes breakfast and supper. You cause trouble, you're out. You bring men around, you're out. You drink, you're out. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Kowalski studied her for another moment, then stepped aside. "Come in, then. You look like you're about to fall over." Clara stepped into a narrow hallway that smelled of lye soap and old wood. The walls were covered in faded floral paper, and a steep staircase led to the second floor. Mrs. Kowalski gestured toward the stairs. "Third door on the left. Washrooms at the end of the hall. Supper's at 6. Don't be late." "Thank you," Clara said. I know who you are," Mrs. Kowalski interrupted. "Whole town knows by now. The bride in the wedding dress who claims to be Daniel Hale's mother." She paused, her expression softening just slightly. "I knew Ethan's wife, his real wife, Margaret. She died bringing Daniel into the world, so whatever story you're selling, you should know it's going to be an uphill climb. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. His wife. Margaret Hale, sweetest girl you'd ever meet. They married young and she died young. Ethan raised that boy alone and he did it well. So if you think you're going to walk in here and I'm not trying to take anything from anyone, Clara said, and her voice came out stronger than she felt. But Daniel is my son. I don't know who Margaret was, but I know who I am. Mrs. Kowalski's eyes narrowed. Well, that's a story I haven't heard yet. She gestured toward the stairs again. Go on up, get yourself cleaned up. We'll talk at supper. Clara climbed the stairs on shaking legs, found the third door and pushed it open. The room was small, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair, but it was clean, and the window looked out over the street toward the mountains beyond. She closed the door, locked it, and finally let herself collapse. The bed creaked beneath her weight. Clara curled on her side, still wearing the ruined wedding dress, and stared at the wall. Her mind felt fractured, unable to process everything that had happened in the span of an hour. Daniel was alive. That was the miracle. But he had another mother, a dead mother, a beloved mother, and Ethan, the man she'd known briefly, desperately, in a whirlwind week 5 years ago, had built a life without her, a life where she was the villain of the story. Clara closed her eyes and tried to remember that week. She'd been 19, running from her father's house in Philadelphia after he'd announced her engagement to Howard Blackwell, a man 3 times her age with a reputation for cruelty. She'd taken a train west with money stolen from her father's desk, intending to disappear into the frontier. She'd made it as far as Cheyenne before the money ran out. That's where she'd met Ethan. He'd been younger then, less weathered, working as a ranch hand and saving money to buy his own land. They'd met in a boarding house dining room and something had sparked between them, something immediate and undeniable. 5 days. That's all they'd had. 5 days of talking and walking and falling into something that felt like destiny. On the 5th night, they'd given in to the pull between them, and Clara had known even then that she was taking a risk, that consequences could follow. But she'd been young and reckless and desperate for something real. The next morning, her father's men had found her. They dragged her back to Philadelphia in chains. By the time she arrived, she was already pregnant, though she didn't know it yet. Her father had been furious, not about the pregnancy, but about the scandal, the defiance, the shame she'd brought to his name. He'd forced her to marry Howard Blackwell in a private ceremony, then locked her in the east wing of the house until the baby was born. Clara had given birth alone, with only a midwife her father trusted to keep secrets. She'd held Daniel for maybe an hour, long enough to count his fingers, memorize his face, whisper promises she'd meant to keep. Then they'd taken him. Her father had told her the baby died. He'd shown her a death certificate, a tiny coffin, a grave in the family plot. He'd made her believe it was real. When she'd finally broken, screaming and clawing and refusing to accept the lie, he'd had her committed. The asylum had been easy to arrange, a hysterical woman grieving a dead child, making wild accusations against her own father. The doctors had believed him. Everyone had believed him. For 2 years, Clara had lived in that place, drugged into compliance, locked away from the world. It had taken another 2 years to prove she was sane, to convince the right people that she'd been wrongly imprisoned, to finally secure her release. And even then, she'd had nothing. No money, no rights, no proof that her son had ever existed, except for the letter. The letter she'd written to herself on a night when hope had seemed impossible, when she'd needed something to hold on to. She'd addressed it to Ethan Hale, Sweetwater, Wyoming, the only details she remembered from those 5 desperate days. She'd never sent it. She'd kept it hidden, a talisman, a reminder that somewhere in the world her son might still be alive. Now she knew he was, but knowing wasn't enough. Clara sat up slowly, her body aching from exhaustion and travel. She looked at the wedding dress, the costume her father had forced her to wear for the ceremony with Howard Blackwell, the symbol of everything stolen from her. She stood, unlaced the dress with trembling fingers, and let it fall to the floor. Beneath it, she wore a thin chemise and nothing else. She went to the washstand, poured water from the pitcher, and scrubbed at her face and hands until her skin was raw. In the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized herself. Hollow cheeks, dark circles under her eyes, hair that hadn't been properly cut in 4 years. But she was free. And Daniel was alive. That would have to be enough. Clara opened her carpet bag, the one possession she'd managed to take from the asylum, and pulled out the only other dress she owned, a simple gray cotton work dress she'd bought with the last of the money a sympathetic nurse had given her. She put it on, braided her hair, and sat on the edge of the bed to wait for supper. Outside, the sun tracked slowly across the Wyoming sky, and somewhere in this small town, her son was learning to live without her all over again. But Clara had survived 4 years of hell. She could survive this too. She would prove who she was. She would prove what had been done to her. And somehow, impossibly, she would find her way back to the child who'd called her mama, even if Ethan Hale never believed another word she said. The dining room at Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house held 6 tables, but only 3 were occupied when Clara came down at 6 o'clock. She'd spent the afternoon lying on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to gather strength for what came next. Now, dressed in the gray cotton dress that marked her as respectable poverty, she descended the stairs with her spine straight and her chin up, prepared for whatever judgment awaited. Mrs. Kowalski stood at the head of the room, ladling stew into bowls. She glanced at Clara, nodded toward an empty chair at the table nearest the kitchen, and said nothing. Clara sat, folding her hands in her lap, acutely aware of the silence that had fallen over the room. The other boarders were watching. An elderly man with trembling hands, 2 women who looked like sisters, both middle-aged and pinch-faced, a younger man, maybe 25, with the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors. None of them spoke, but their eyes said everything. Mrs. Kowalski set a bowl of stew in front of Clara. The smell made her stomach clench with hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, a piece of hardtack on the train. But she waited, following the lead of the others, as the elderly man bowed his head and murmured a brief prayer. When he finished, everyone began to eat. Clara picked up her spoon with steady hands and took a bite. The stew was simple, beef and potatoes and carrots, but it was hot and real, and she had to force herself not to devour it like an animal. "You're the one who came in on the afternoon train." It wasn't a question. One of the sisters, the one with gray streaking through her brown hair, had spoken, her voice carefully neutral. Clara swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." "Caused quite a stir, I heard." "I didn't intend to cause trouble." "Trouble's not usually intentional," the woman said, "but it follows some people all the same." She took a deliberate bite of stew, chewed slowly, and added, "I'm Dorothy Miller. This is my sister, Ruth." Ruth, the younger sister, smiled thinly. "We run the seamstress shop on Main Street. Been here 15 years. The implication was clear. They belonged here, and Clara did not. Clara nodded, acknowledging the territorial claim without challenging it. "I'm Clara Whitmore." "We know," Dorothy said. "Whole town knows. You're the woman claiming to be Daniel Hale's mother." "I'm not claiming anything. I am his mother." Ruth's eyebrows rose. "That's a bold statement, considering Ethan Hale's been raising that boy alone since birth." "I know what it looks like," Clara said carefully. "But appearances aren't always truth." "Then what is the truth?" This came from the young man across the table. He had sharp blue eyes and a direct way of speaking that suggested he didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you abandoned a baby and came back 4 years later expecting everyone to forget about it." Clara set down her spoon. "I didn't abandon anyone. I was taken against my will and locked away. By the time I escaped, 4 years had passed." "Locked away where?" Dorothy demanded. "An asylum. In Philadelphia." The word dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Ruth's mouth thinned. Dorothy's eyes narrowed. The young man leaned back in his chair, reassessing her. Mrs. Kowalski, who had been standing near the kitchen door, moved closer. "That's enough," she said quietly. "The girl's eating supper, not standing trial." "But, Mrs. Kowalski," Dorothy began. "Enough." The word carried weight. Dorothy pressed her lips together and returned to her stew, but her expression remained hostile. The rest of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence. Clara forced herself to eat slowly, to keep her hand steady, to give no sign of the turmoil churning inside her. When she'd finished, she stood, thanked Mrs. Kowalski for the meal, and turned to leave. "Miss Whitmore." Mrs. Kowalski's voice stopped her at the doorway. "A word, please." Clara followed the older woman into the kitchen, a cramped space dominated by a cast-iron stove and shelves lined with jars of preserves. Mrs. Kowalski shut the door and faced her with arms crossed. "You need to understand something," she said. "Ethan Hale is respected in this town. He's built a good life here, raised his son right, helped his neighbors. People like him. People trust him." "I understand that." "Do you?" Mrs. Kowalski's eyes were sharp. "Because it means when you make accusations against him, when you claim he stole your child or lied about his past, people aren't going to take your side. They're going to protect him." "I'm not making accusations against Ethan," Clara said. "I'm telling the truth about what happened to me." "Your truth or the truth?" The question hit like a slap. Clara took a breath, steadying herself. "There's only one truth, Mrs. Kowalski. I gave birth to Daniel Hale 5 years ago. I was separated from him against my will. I've spent 4 years trying to find him. That's not a story. That's what happened." Mrs. Kowalski studied her for a long moment. "You have proof of any of this?" "I have a letter I wrote to myself. It has Daniel's name, Ethan's name, this town's name. I wrote it 2 years ago." "That proves you knew about them. Doesn't prove you're the mother." Clara felt something crack inside her. "What would prove it? What evidence would possibly be enough?" "I don't know," Mrs. Kowalski said, and for the first time her expression softened slightly. "But you're going to need something more than a letter and a torn wedding dress. This town runs on reputation, girl. Right now yours is buried under scandal." "Then how do I fix it?" "You start by staying quiet. You work. You prove you're stable. You give people time to see you're not crazy or dangerous. And maybe they'll start to listen." Clara wanted to scream that she didn't have time, that every day Daniel believed she'd abandoned him was another day stolen from both of them, but she swallowed the words and nodded. "Thank you for the advice." Mrs. Kowalski sighed. "There's something else you should know. Margaret Hale, Ethan's wife, she was real. She did die in childbirth. The whole town mourned her." Clara's chest tightened. "Then who—" "I don't know," Mrs. Kowalski interrupted. "I'm just telling you what I know. Margaret was a good woman. She and Ethan were childhood sweethearts. They got married young, and she got pregnant right away. She died bringing that baby into the world, and Ethan nearly died from grief. If you're saying Daniel isn't hers, you're saying Ethan's been living a lie for 5 years. You understand how that sounds?" Clara did understand. It sounded impossible. It sounded insane. But she knew what she knew. "I need to talk to him," she said. "To Ethan. I need to make him listen." "Good luck with that," Mrs. Kowalski said. "He's about as approachable as a wounded bear right now." She moved toward the door, then paused. "But if you're determined to try, you should know he runs a ranch about 3 miles north of town. The Double H. He comes into town on Saturdays for supplies." "Thank you." Mrs. Kowalski shook her head. "Don't thank me yet. You might wish you'd never come here before this is over." Clara returned to her room as darkness fell over Sweetwater. She lit the oil lamp on the washstand and sat on the edge of the bed, turning Mrs. Kowalski's words over in her mind. Margaret Hale, a childhood sweetheart, a beloved wife who died in childbirth. It didn't make sense. Clara had given birth to Daniel. She remembered every moment of it, the pain, the fear, the overwhelming rush of love when they'd placed him in her arms. She remembered his weight, his smell, the way his tiny hand had gripped her finger. That had been real. But if Margaret Hale had also died in childbirth, if the whole town believed Daniel was hers, then someone had constructed an elaborate lie. Someone had replaced Clara's story with Margaret's. The question was who and why? Clara pulled out the sealed letter from her carpet bag and finally broke the wax seal. Her own handwriting stared back at her, shaky from the drugs they'd given her but still legible. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 21 years old. I am not insane. My father, Charles Whitmore, had me committed to silence me. I gave birth to a son on March 15th, 1886. His name is Daniel. His father is Ethan Hale of Sweetwater, Wyoming. If I ever get out of here, I will find them. This is the truth. This is real. I am not crazy. Below that, she'd written the address, Ethan Hale, Double H Ranch, Sweetwater, Wyoming Territory, over and over, as if repetition could make it more true. Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it back in her bag. It wasn't proof, but it was something. Evidence that she'd known about Daniel and Ethan long before she'd arrived in Sweetwater. Tomorrow, she would find work. She would establish herself as stable, reliable, sane. She would give the town time to see her as a person, not a scandal. And then she would find a way to talk to Ethan Hale, even if he hated her, even if he never believed her. She had to try. The next morning, Clara woke to pale sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of wagons rumbling past on Main Street. She dressed quickly, braided her hair, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Kowalski already up, kneading bread dough with strong, practiced hands. "There's coffee on the stove," Mrs. Kowalski said without looking up. "Breakfast is in an hour." Clara poured herself a cup of coffee, weak and bitter, but hot, and stood near the window watching the town wake up. Shopkeepers swept their stoops. A woman carried a basket of laundry toward the creek. Two men on horseback rode past, their faces shadowed by hat brims. "I need to find work," Clara said. "Is there anyone in town who might be hiring?" Mrs. Kowalski considered this while shaping the dough into loaves. "You have any skills?" "I can read and write. I can keep accounts. I can sew, though not professionally." "Mrs. Chen at the laundry is always looking for help. It's hard work, but she pays fair." "Where do I find her?" "End of Main Street, past the blacksmith. You can't miss it. There's always steam coming out the windows." Mrs. Kowalski placed the loaves in the oven and wiped her hands on her apron. "But Clara, you should know, Mrs. Chen doesn't tolerate drama. You bring your troubles to her door, she'll send you packing." "I understand." After breakfast, oatmeal and toast that Clara ate quickly, aware of Dorothy and Ruth watching her with undisguised suspicion, she walked to the laundry. The morning was cool, the air sharp with the promise of autumn. Sweetwater looked different in daylight, smaller and more worn than she'd first thought. The buildings needed paint. The streets needed grading. But there was something solid about the place, something that spoke of people who stayed and built and endured. The laundry was exactly where Mrs. Kowalski had said, a long, narrow building with windows that dripped condensation and a door propped open to release clouds of steam. Clara stepped inside and was immediately enveloped in heat and the sharp smell of lye soap. A small Chinese woman stood at a massive tub, scrubbing a sheet against a washboard with fierce efficiency. She looked up as Clara entered, her face unreadable. "Mrs. Chen?" Clara asked. "What you want?" "I'm looking for work. Mrs. Kowalski said you might be hiring." Mrs. Chen set down the sheet and wiped her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50, with gray threading through her black hair and eyes that assessed Clara with unsettling directness. "You the woman from the train," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "The one who says she Ethan Hale's boy's mama." "Yes." Mrs. Chen picked up the sheet and returned to scrubbing. "I don't care about that. You work hard. You stay. You make trouble. You go. Clear?" Relief flooded through Clara. "Very clear." "You start now. Apron on the hook. We have 20 loads today. You do what I say, no questions." Clara grabbed the apron and tied it around her waist. Mrs. Chen pointed to a pile of dirty linens in the corner. "Sort those, white separate from color. Stains go in the soaking tub." The work was backbreaking. Clara's hands were soft from 4 years of forced idleness, and within an hour they were red and raw from the hot water and harsh soap. Her back ached from bending over the tubs. Her arms trembled from wringing out heavy sheets. But she didn't complain. She worked steadily, following Mrs. Chen's terse instructions, learning the rhythm of the laundry. At noon, Mrs. Chen handed her a bowl of rice and vegetables. They ate standing up, too tired to sit. "You do good work," Mrs. Chen said. "You come back tomorrow?" "Yes," Clara said. "Thank you." "Pay is 50 cents a day. You work 6 days, you get $3. It was barely enough to cover her room and board, but it was a start. Clara nodded. "I'll be here." She worked until sunset. until her hands were too sore to grip the washboard, until the pile of dirty linens had been transformed into neat stacks of clean, folded sheets and shirts and dresses. Mrs. Chen counted out 50 cents and placed the coins in Clara's palm. "You come back tomorrow, 7 o'clock," she said. "Don't be late." Clara walked back to the boarding house through the gathering dark, exhaustion weighing on her like a physical thing. Her hands throbbed. Her back ached, but she had money in her pocket and work to return to, and that was more than she'd had 24 hours ago. The pattern held for the rest of the week. Clara woke at dawn, worked at the laundry until dark, ate supper at Mrs. Kowalski's table, while the other boarders watched her with varying degrees of suspicion, and fell into bed too tired to think. She saw glimpses of Sweetwater's life, the mercantile where women gathered to gossip, the schoolhouse where children played during recess, the church where people filed in on Sunday mornings. But she remained separate from it all, a ghost moving through a world that didn't want her. She didn't see Ethan. She didn't see Daniel. The absence was a constant ache, worse than her blistered hands, worse than the loneliness. She'd come so far, risked everything, and now she was trapped in a holding pattern, unable to move forward, terrified to move back. On Saturday morning, Mrs. Chen gave her the day off. "You work hard all week. You rest now." Clara didn't want to rest. Resting meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering Daniel's face when he'd reached for her, the sound of his voice saying "Mama," the weight of him in her arms for those few precious seconds. Instead, she walked. She explored Sweetwater's narrow streets, learning the geography of the town that held her son. The mercantile, the livery stable, the doctor's office, the small cemetery on the hill where weathered headstones marked the town's dead. She was walking past the mercantile when she heard it, a child's laughter, high and clear. Clara froze, turned, saw him. Daniel stood on the mercantile porch with a woman Clara didn't recognize, young, pretty, with dark hair pinned up beneath a bonnet. The woman was helping him carry a small bag of supplies, and Daniel was chattering excitedly about something, his face bright with joy. Clara's feet moved without permission, carrying her across the street. She didn't have a plan, didn't think beyond the desperate need to be close to him, to hear his voice, to exist in the same space. She was 10 feet away when the woman looked up and saw her. The woman's expression changed instantly, hardening into protective hostility. She put a hand on Daniel's shoulder, pulling him back. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice cold. Clara stopped. I wanted to." Daniel looked at her. For a moment there was recognition in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been memory or longing. Then the woman spoke again, sharper this time. "You need to leave, now." "Please," Clara said, "I just want to talk to him." "You don't have the right to talk to him." The woman pulled Daniel behind her, shielding him with her body. "You need to go before I call the sheriff." "Sarah," the voice came from behind Clara, deep and familiar and edged with warning. "Take Daniel inside." Clara turned. Ethan stood in the street, his hat in his hands, his face carved from stone. He looked at her the way someone might look at a snake coiled in the road, wary, angry, ready to strike. Sarah, the woman with Daniel, nodded and hurried the boy into the mercantile. Daniel looked back over his shoulder, his gray eyes wide and confused, and then the door shut between them. Clara and Ethan faced each other across 5 feet of dusty street. "I told you to stay away from him," Ethan said quietly. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I just saw him and I—" "You what?" "Thought you'd introduce yourself. Tell him stories about his real mother?" Ethan's voice rose. "You're scaring him, Clara. You're confusing him, and I won't allow it." "I'm his mother," Clara said, and she was shaking now, from anger or grief or exhaustion, she couldn't tell. "I have a right to know him." "You have nothing. No rights, no claim. You're a stranger who showed up in a wedding dress with a wild story about asylums and kidnapping, and you expect me to just hand over my son?" "Our son." "No." Ethan stepped closer, and Clara saw the rage in his eyes, the fear beneath it. "My son, mine and Margaret's. You don't get to rewrite history just because you decided to come back." "Margaret didn't give birth to him," Clara said desperately. "I did. I remember it, Ethan. I remember everything. Then you remember wrong, or you're lying. Either way, it doesn't matter. He turned away, started toward the mercantile. Clara grabbed his arm. Wait, please. Just listen to me for 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Ethan stopped. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. Then he pulled his arm free and faced her again. 5 minutes, he said, but not here. People are watching. He walked toward the edge of town and Clara followed, her heart pounding. They stopped near the livery stable, away from curious eyes, and Ethan crossed his arms, waiting. Clara took a breath. 5 years ago, I met you in Cheyenne. We had 5 days together. On the last night, She faltered, heat rising in her cheeks. You know what happened. I remember, Ethan said flatly. The next morning, my father's men found me. They took me back to Philadelphia. I was already pregnant, but I didn't know it yet. The words came faster now, tumbling over each other. My father forced me to marry a man named Howard Blackwell. He locked me away until the baby was born. When Daniel came, I held him for maybe an hour. Then they took him and told me he was dead. Ethan's expression didn't change. Convenient that you can't prove any of this. I can prove I was in an asylum. I have release papers. I can prove I was married to Howard Blackwell. I can prove my father had the money and influence to make people disappear. Clara pulled the letter from her pocket. And I have this. I wrote it 2 years ago when I still hoped I could find you. Ethan took the letter, unfolded it, read it slowly. When he finished, he handed it back. This proves you knew my name and Daniel's name. Doesn't prove you're his mother. What would prove it? Clara demanded. What evidence would possibly be enough? I don't know, Ethan said, and for the first time she heard uncertainty in his voice. But what you're asking me to believe, that Margaret never existed, that someone stole your baby and gave him to me, that I've been living a lie for 5 years, it's impossible. But Margaret did exist, Clara said slowly, pieces falling into place. Mrs. Kowalski told me. She was your childhood sweetheart. She died in childbirth. Yes, Ethan said. She did. When? 5 years ago, March 15th. Clara's breath caught. That's the day I gave birth to Daniel. Silence fell between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to examine. It's a coincidence, Ethan finally said. Is it? Clara pressed. What if someone used Margaret's death to hide where Daniel really came from? What if they told you the baby was yours and Margaret's, when he was really— Stop. Ethan's voice cracked like a whip. Just stop. You're trying to twist everything to fit your story, but it doesn't work. I was there when Daniel was born. I held Margaret's hand. I watched her die, bringing him into the world. Did you see the birth? Clara asked quietly. Were you in the room? Ethan's jaw tightened. They wouldn't let me in. The doctor said it was too dangerous. Who was the doctor? Dr. Brennan. He died 2 years ago. Convenient, Clara said, echoing his earlier word. Ethan stepped back as if she'd struck him. You need to stop this. Whatever you think happened, whatever you want to believe, you're wrong. Daniel is my son. Margaret was his mother. That's the truth. Then why does he recognize me? Clara asked. Why did he call me Mama the moment he saw me? He's 4 years old. He was confused. He wasn't confused. He knew me. Ethan shook his head. I can't do this. I can't listen to this. He started to walk away. Ethan, please. He stopped, looked back at her with eyes full of something that might have been pain or pity. I'm sorry for whatever happened to you, Clara. I truly am. But I can't help you, and I can't let you hurt my son. He walked away, leaving Clara standing alone by the livery stable, the letter still clutched in her hand. She stood there for a long time, watching the town move around her, feeling the weight of impossibility settle on her shoulders. Ethan was right. What she was asking him to believe was insane, but it was also true. Daniel was her son. She didn't know how to prove it, didn't know how to make anyone believe her. But she knew one thing, she wasn't leaving, not without a fight. Clara folded the letter, tucked it back in her pocket, and started walking toward the boarding house. The sun beat down on her shoulders, and somewhere in this town, her son was learning to fear her. She would change that. Somehow. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Clara's life, and that was saying something for a woman who'd survived 4 years in an asylum. She fell into a rhythm that felt like slow suffocation. Wake before dawn, work at the laundry until her hands bled, eat silent meals at Mrs. Kowalski's table while the other boarders pretended she didn't exist, collapse into bed too exhausted to cry. Every day was the same. Every day was unbearable. But she stayed. She stayed because on Saturdays, Ethan brought Daniel into town for supplies, and if Clara positioned herself carefully near the mercantile, she could catch glimpses of her son. She never approached, never spoke. She'd learned that lesson, but she watched, memorizing the way Daniel moved, the sound of his laughter, the way he held Ethan's hand while they walked. She stayed because Mrs. Chen, who asked no questions and offered no sympathy, had given her something precious, purpose. The work at the laundry was honest and hard, and it kept Clara's hands busy when her mind wanted to spiral into despair. And she stayed because leaving would mean admitting defeat, and Clara had not survived this long by giving up. It was mid-October when everything changed. Clara was scrubbing a particularly stubborn stain from a tablecloth when Mrs. Chen appeared at her elbow, her face tight with worry. "You have visitor," Mrs. Chen said. "In front." Clara straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Who?" "The woman, Sarah, from Mercantile." Clara's heart lurched. Sarah was the woman who'd shielded Daniel from her, the one who'd threatened to call the sheriff. Clara couldn't imagine why she'd come to the laundry, but it couldn't be good. She walked to the front of the building and found Sarah waiting on the wooden sidewalk, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. Up close, Clara could see she was younger than she'd first appeared, maybe 23 or 24, with fine features and intelligent hazel eyes. "Miss Whitmore," Sarah said stiffly. "Mrs. Clara hesitated, realizing she didn't know Sarah's last name. "Garrett. Sarah Garrett. I'm Ethan's neighbor. I help with Daniel sometimes." "I see." Sarah glanced at the laundry, at Clara's red, chapped hands, at the simple dress that had seen too many washings. "Can we talk? Somewhere private?" Clara's pulse quickened. "There's a bench behind the building. We won't be disturbed." They walked in silence to the small courtyard behind the laundry, where Mrs. Chen hung clothes to dry when the weather permitted. The bench was old and weathered, but it held them both. Sarah sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, and for a long moment she said nothing. "I don't trust you," she finally said. "I want that clear from the start." Clara nodded. "I understand. But something's been bothering me, something I can't explain away." Sarah took a breath. "Daniel has nightmares. He's had them since he was old enough to talk. Always the same dream. He's crying for his mother, but she can't hear him. He's locked in a dark room, and she's on the other side of the door, calling his name." Clara's throat closed. She couldn't breathe. "Ethan thinks it's just a child's fear of losing a parent," Sarah continued. "He rocks him back to sleep, tells him it's not real, but the night after you arrived, after Daniel saw you at the train station, he had the worst nightmare he's ever had. He woke up screaming that his mama couldn't find him, that she was looking but couldn't see him." "What did Ethan do?" "He held him, told him his mama was in heaven, that she'd always watch over him. But Daniel kept saying no, that his mama was here, that she'd come back." Sarah's eyes were hard when she looked at Clara. "He meant you." Clara wiped at her face with trembling hands. "I don't understand. How could he remember? He was just hours old when they took him from me." "I don't know. But there's something else." Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded many times. "I found this in Daniel's room, under his pillow. He drew it 2 years ago, when he was barely 3. She unfolded the paper and handed it to Clara. The drawing was crude, done in the uncertain hand of a very young child, but the image was clear enough. A woman with long, dark hair. A small boy reaching up to her. And between them, black scribbles that might have been bars or a wall or distance. Clara's hand shook so badly she almost dropped the paper. "May I keep this?" "No," Sarah said, taking it back. "I shouldn't have shown it to you at all, but I needed to see your face when you looked at it." "And what did you see?" "Recognition, pain, the same expression Daniel gets when he wakes from those nightmares. Sarah refolded the paper carefully and returned it to her pocket. I'm not saying I believe you. I'm not saying anything you've claimed is true. But I'm saying there's something here that doesn't add up, and I think you deserve a chance to prove yourself. How? Clara asked. Ethan won't listen to me. The town thinks I'm insane. I have no proof, no evidence, nothing but my word. Then find proof, Sarah said. You say you were in an asylum. Get the records. You say your father forced you into a marriage. Get the marriage certificate. You say a doctor attended the birth. Find out who it was. Build a case that can't be ignored. I don't have money for lawyers. I don't have connections. I don't even know where to start. Start with the truth, Sarah said. All of it. Not just the parts you think will make you look sympathetic. Tell me everything that happened, from the moment you met Ethan to the moment you stepped off that train, and I'll decide if you're worth helping. Clara looked at this woman who had every reason to hate her, who was risking her own reputation by even talking to her, and made a choice. She told her everything. She started with Philadelphia, with her father's house and the engagement she'd run from. She described meeting Ethan in Cheyenne, the 5 days that had felt like destiny, the night they'd spent together. She explained how her father's men had found her, dragged her home, locked her away when they discovered she was pregnant. She told Sarah about the birth, the pain, the terror, the overwhelming rush of love when they'd placed Daniel in her arms. She described how they'd taken him away while she was still bleeding, how they'd showed her a death certificate and a tiny coffin and a grave that she'd later learned was empty. She explained the asylum, the drugs that made her forget her own name, the years of fighting to prove she wasn't insane. She showed Sarah the scars on her wrists from the restraints, the places where her hair had been cut short by nurses who didn't care about dignity. And she told Sarah about the letter, the one piece of hope she'd clung to through 4 years of hell. When she finished, the sun had moved across the sky, and her voice was hoarse from talking. Sarah sat silent, her face unreadable. You're asking me to believe that your father, a wealthy, powerful man, committed fraud, kidnapping, and false imprisonment just to cover up a scandal, Sarah finally said. Yes. And that someone in this town helped him. Someone who took your baby and gave him to Ethan, claiming he was Margaret Hale's son. Yes. Do you know how insane that sounds? I lived it, Clara said quietly. I know exactly how insane it sounds. Sarah stood, pacing the small courtyard. If what you're saying is true, if even half of it is true, then Ethan has been lied to. Daniel has been lied to. This whole town has been lied to. I know. And you expect me to help you prove it? I'm not expecting anything, but you said yourself something doesn't add up. The nightmares, the drawing, the way Daniel recognized me. Clara stood as well, facing Sarah. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to help me find the truth. Whatever it is. Sarah stopped pacing and looked at Clara for a long, assessing moment. If I do this, if I help you, and it turns out you're lying, that you're using me to get close to Daniel for some sick reason, I will destroy you. Do you understand? I understand. And if it turns out you're telling the truth, it's going to break Ethan's heart. It's going to shatter everything he believes about his life, his son, his late wife. Are you prepared for that? Clara thought about Ethan's face when he'd told her to stay away, the rage and fear in his eyes, the way he'd held Daniel like he was afraid Clara would steal him. No, she admitted, but I'm prepared to face it anyway, because Daniel deserves to know the truth, even if it hurts. Sarah nodded slowly. Then we start with the marriage certificate. You said your father forced you to marry Howard Blackwell. That would be a matter of public record in Philadelphia. I don't know how to get access to those records from here. You write to the county clerk, request a copy. It'll take a few weeks, but it's a start. Sarah pulled a small notepad from her pocket and scribbled something. I have a cousin in Philadelphia. She's a teacher, knows how to navigate bureaucracy. I'll write to her, ask her to look into your father's affairs. See if there's any evidence of the asylum commitment. Hope flickered in Clara's chest, dangerous and fragile. Why are you doing this? Because I love Daniel like he was my own, Sarah said simply. And if there's even a chance he's been separated from his real mother, if there's even a possibility that someone stole him and lied about it, then he deserves to know. Even if it destroys the life he knows. She tucked the notepad away. But Clara, if this goes forward, you need to understand something. The truth might not set you free. It might not give you back your son. It might just make everything worse. I know, Clara said, but I have to try. Sarah studied her for another moment, then nodded. Meet me here next Saturday. Same time. I'll tell you what I found. She walked away without another word, leaving Clara standing in the courtyard with something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. The days until Saturday crawled by with excruciating slowness. Clara worked at the laundry, scrubbing and wringing and folding until her body ached, but her mind was elsewhere, spinning through possibilities and fears. What if Sarah's cousin found nothing? What if the records had been destroyed? What if Clara's father had been thorough enough to erase every trace of what he'd done? But on Saturday afternoon, when Sarah appeared at the laundry with a letter in her hand, Clara knew immediately that something had changed. They went to the courtyard again, and Sarah handed her the letter without preamble. My cousin works fast. Read it. Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded the pages. The handwriting was neat and precise, the words clinical. Dear Sarah, I've made inquiries regarding Clara Whitmore and her family as you requested. What I've uncovered is deeply disturbing. Charles Whitmore is indeed a prominent Philadelphia businessman, but he has a reputation for ruthlessness that borders on cruelty. I spoke with several sources who confirmed that his daughter Clara disappeared in 1885 and was rumored to have been committed to the Haverford Asylum for Women. I was able to obtain asylum records through a contact who works in medical archives. Clara Whitmore was admitted on May 3, 1886, by order of her father. The commitment papers cite hysteria, delusions, and danger to self and others. She was released on August 15, 1890, after a lengthy legal battle initiated by a reform-minded lawyer who specialized in wrongful commitment cases. The records also note that Clara gave birth to a male child on March 15, 1886, while in the asylum. The child's fate is listed as remanded to family custody. There is no death certificate on file for this child. I've attached copies of the relevant documents. I hope this helps your investigation, though I confess I'm deeply curious about the circumstances. Your cousin, Elizabeth. Clara read the letter twice, then a third time, unable to believe what she was seeing. Proof. Actual, documented proof that she'd been telling the truth. There's more, Sarah said quietly. She pulled out several additional pages, photocopies of asylum records, admission papers signed by Charles Whitmore, medical notes describing Clara's condition and treatment. And at the bottom, a birth record noting the delivery of a male infant, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, healthy, no complications. This proves I gave birth, Clara whispered. This proves everything I said about the asylum was true. It proves you were committed and that you had a baby, Sarah corrected. It doesn't prove the baby was Daniel. But it's a start. It's something. It's enough to raise questions, Sarah agreed. But we need more. We need to connect the baby born in that asylum to the baby that appeared here in Sweetwater. We need to figure out how Daniel got from Philadelphia to Wyoming and who arranged it. Clara's mind raced. The doctor, the one who attended Margaret's death. Ethan said his name was Dr. Brennan. He died 2 years ago. I told you that. But he must have had records, medical files, something that documented Margaret's pregnancy and death. Sarah's eyes narrowed. His widow still lives here, Mrs. Brennan. She's elderly, not very social, but she might have kept her husband's papers. Can you talk to her? I can try, but Clara, you need to understand. If we find those records, and they show that Margaret really did die in childbirth, it complicates your story. It doesn't disprove it, but it makes it harder to believe. Or it confirms that 2 women gave birth on the same day, and someone used one woman's tragedy to hide another woman's child, Clara said. Talk to Mrs. Brennan, please. Sarah nodded. I'll go this afternoon. But Clara, you need to prepare yourself for whatever we find. The wait was agony. Clara tried to work, but her hands shook so badly she kept dropping things. Mrs. Chen finally sent her home early, telling her to rest, that she was no use in this state. Clara walked back to the boarding house in a daze, the asylum records folded in her pocket, proof of her suffering pressed against her heart. She was sitting on the porch when Sarah returned, just as the sun was setting. Sarah's face was pale, her expression shaken. What did you find? Clara asked, standing. Sarah climbed the steps slowly and sat on the bench, gesturing for Clara to join her. Mrs. Brennan kept everything, every file, every record, every note her husband ever wrote. She's a meticulous woman, couldn't bear to throw away his life's work. And Margaret Hale went into labor on March 14, 1886. Dr. Brennan attended her. The labor was difficult, lasted nearly 24 hours. Margaret died on March 15th at approximately 3 p.m. from hemorrhaging. The baby, a boy, was delivered alive just before she died. Clara felt her world tilting. Then it's true. Margaret did have a baby. Wait, Sarah said. There's more. I read through all of Dr. Brennan's notes from that week. He was a thorough man, recorded everything. On March 16th, he made a notation that confused me. He wrote, "Examined infant again. Initial concerns unfounded. Child healthy and strong. E. Hale greatly relieved." I don't understand. What concerns? I asked Mrs. Brennan about it. She remembered that delivery. It was traumatic. Margaret's death devastated the town. She said Dr. Brennan had been worried because the baby initially seemed weak, possibly premature. But when he examined him the next day, the baby was perfectly healthy, robust even. She remembered because Dr. Brennan had remarked on it, said it was unusual for a baby to improve so dramatically overnight. Clara's breath caught. Or it wasn't the same baby. That's what I thought, Sarah said quietly. What if Margaret's baby was weak or stillborn, and someone with access and authority switched him with a healthy baby? Your baby? But who would do that? And why? I don't know. But Clara, there's something else. I found a telegram in Dr. Brennan's files, dated March 14th. It was from someone in Philadelphia asking about the availability of wet nurses and infant care in the Sweetwater area. It was signed C. Whitmore. The name hit Clara like a physical blow. My father. It's not proof, Sarah said quickly. It could be a coincidence. There might be other Whitmores in Philadelphia, but the timing is too perfect to be coincidence, Clara finished. My father knew I was about to give birth. He knew Margaret Hale was in labor at the same time, and he arranged for Daniel to be taken from me and given to Ethan. But why? Why go to such elaborate lengths? Why not just take the baby and raise him himself, or put him up for adoption? Clara thought about her father, about his obsession with reputation and control, about the way he'd erased her from his life the moment she became inconvenient. Because I humiliated him. I ran away, got pregnant out of wedlock, refused the marriage he'd arranged. Taking Daniel from me wasn't enough. He wanted to make sure I could never find him. And using Margaret's death, giving Daniel to his real father, but hiding the truth about his mother, was the perfect solution. Ethan got a son, my father got revenge, and I was left with nothing. Sarah was quiet for a long time. If this is true, if your father really did orchestrate this, then we need more than speculation. We need concrete evidence. We need someone who was there, someone who can testify to what happened. Everyone who was there is either dead or working for my father. What about the wet nurse? The one your father asked about in the telegram? Clara's mind raced. I don't know who she was. I don't even know if my father found someone. Ethan would know. Daniel was nursed by someone in those early weeks. Ethan couldn't feed him himself. If we can find out who that woman was, if we can talk to her. Ethan won't tell me anything. He won't even speak to me. Then I'll ask him, Sarah said. I'll make up some reason, say I'm curious about infant care, something. I'll find out who nursed Daniel. Clara grabbed Sarah's hand. Why are you doing this? Why are you risking so much to help me? Sarah's eyes were sad when she answered. Because I watched Ethan grieve Margaret. I watched him pour all his love into Daniel, building a life from ashes and loss. If that life was built on a lie, if Daniel was stolen from you and given to Ethan without his knowledge, then they both deserve to know the truth, even if it breaks them. She stood, squeezing Clara's hand once before letting go. I'll talk to Ethan tomorrow. Meet me here Monday evening. The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety and hope. Clara could barely eat, barely sleep. She kept touching the asylum records in her pocket, reassuring herself they were real, that she wasn't imagining this chance at vindication. On Monday evening, she waited in the courtyard behind the laundry, pacing in the fading light. Sarah arrived just after sunset, and her face told Clara everything before she spoke. Her name was Ruth Coleman. She was a widow, lived on a farm about 10 miles outside town. She nursed Daniel for the first 6 months of his life. Was? Clara's heart sank. She died 3 years ago. Influenza. Then we've lost another witness. Not necessarily. Sarah pulled out her notepad. Ruth had a daughter, Mary Coleman. She's 20 now, lives in town, works at the seamstress shop. I spoke to her this afternoon. Clara's pulse quickened. What did she say? She remembers the arrangement because it was unusual. Her mother was hired to nurse Daniel before he was even born. Someone, a man she never met, sent a letter and a substantial payment asking Ruth to be available starting March 15th. Ruth thought it was strange, planning for a wet nurse before the baby arrived, but the money was good, and she'd just lost her own infant. She needed the work. Did Mary remember anything else? She was only 15 at the time, but she remembered her mother being upset after the first day with Daniel. Ruth kept saying something wasn't right, that the baby didn't look premature like she'd been told, that he was too healthy, too strong. But when she tried to ask questions, the man who'd hired her, the same man who'd sent the letter, told her to do her job and keep her mouth shut. Did she see this man? Could she describe him? Mary doesn't remember. She was young, and the man never came to their farm. He always met Ruth in town. But Clara, Sarah hesitated. Mary said her mother kept the letter. The one that hired her, she kept all her important papers in a box, and when she died, Mary packed everything away. She still has it. Hope surged through Clara so violently she had to sit down. Can we see it? I asked. Mary's willing to look for it, but she wants to know why it matters. I told her I was researching the history of midwifery in the area, but I don't think she believed me. We need to tell her the truth. What if she doesn't believe us? What if she destroys the letter? Then we've lost our chance, Sarah said. But Clara, I've gotten to know Mary over the years. She's honest, fair-minded. If we explain the situation, show her the evidence we've already gathered, I think she'll help us. Clara thought about trust, about the risk of placing her hope in strangers, about how many times she'd been betrayed. But she also thought about Daniel, about the truth he deserved, about the fact that she couldn't do this alone. All right, she said. Let's talk to Mary. They went to the seamstress shop the next morning before it opened for business. Mary Coleman was setting out fabric samples when they arrived, and she looked up with surprise when Sarah knocked on the door. Mrs. Garrett, what brings you here so early? Sarah glanced at Clara, then back at Mary. We need to talk to you about your mother, about the work she did for Ethan Hale. Mary's expression grew guarded. I already told you what I remember. I know, Sarah said gently, but there's more to the story than I explained, and it involves Miss Whitmore here. Mary looked at Clara, recognition dawning. You're the woman who claims to be Daniel's mother. I am his mother, Clara said quietly, and I think your mother might have evidence that proves it. She told Mary everything, the same story she'd told Sarah, but with the added weight of the asylum records, the telegram, the suspicious circumstances of Daniel's arrival. Mary listened in silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. When Clara finished, Mary sat down heavily in one of the shop's chairs. You're saying someone stole your baby and gave him to Mr. Hale and my mother was part of it? Not knowingly, Clara said quickly. I think your mother was used just like Ethan was used. The man who hired her, I believe it was my father or someone working for him, needed someone to care for Daniel, and he chose your mother because she was discreet and desperate for work. And you think the letter she kept will prove this? I think it might tell us who hired her, and if that person can be connected to my father, it's one more piece of evidence. Mary stood and walked to the back of the shop, disappearing into a storage room. She returned several minutes later with a small wooden box, its lid carved with flowers. She opened it carefully and sifted through papers, old receipts, certificates, letters tied with ribbon. Near the bottom, she found what she was looking for. The letter was written on expensive paper, the handwriting elegant and impersonal. Mary handed it to Clara with trembling hands. Dear Mrs. Coleman, I am writing to engage your services as a wet nurse for an infant who will be born on or around March 15, 1886. The child's mother has unfortunately died, and the father is unable to provide adequate care. Your reputation for discretion and competence has come to my attention, and I would like to offer you $30 per month for 6 months of service. If you are amenable to this arrangement, please respond to the address below. The child will be delivered to you on March 16th. No questions will be necessary or welcome. Sincerely, Charles Whitmore, Esquire. Clara read the letter 3 times, her hand shaking so badly the paper rattled. Her father's name, his handwriting. Dated 2 weeks before Daniel was born, exactly when Clara would have been locked in the asylum, exactly when her father would have been making arrangements to steal her child. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the proof." Mary's face was white. "My mother was hired by the man who stole your baby." "Your mother didn't know," Clara said urgently. "She was told the baby's mother died. She believed she was helping. She wasn't part of the crime." "But she was part of the cover-up," Mary said, "even if she didn't mean to be." Sarah put a hand on Mary's shoulder. "What your mother did, caring for Daniel, giving him the nourishment he needed, that wasn't wrong. What was wrong was the lies she was told, the way she was used. But Mary, this letter could help us expose the truth. It could help Daniel know who his real mother is." Mary looked at Clara, tears streaming down her face. "If I give you this letter, it's going to destroy Mr. Hale. He loves Daniel more than life itself. Finding out he was lied to, that his son's whole existence is built on fraud." "I know," Clara said, "but he deserves the truth. And so does Daniel." Mary wiped her eyes and nodded. "Take it. Do what you need to do." "But Miss Whitmore," she waited until Clara met her gaze. "If you're lying about any of this, if you're using my mother's memory to hurt people, I will never forgive you." "I'm not lying," Clara said. "I swear on Daniel's life I'm telling the truth." Mary handed her the letter, and Clara held it like the precious thing it was, the final piece of a puzzle that had nearly destroyed her. She had the asylum records. She had the telegram. She had the letter hiring the wet nurse. She had enough evidence to prove that Charles Whitmore had orchestrated the theft of her son. Now she just had to convince Ethan Hale to listen. Sarah insisted they wait until Sunday, not because the evidence wasn't ready, not because they needed more time to prepare, but because Sunday was when the whole town would be gathered in one place. The church service, Sarah explained, was more than just worship in Sweetwater. It was where news spread, where reputations were made or destroyed, where the community decided what was true and what was lies. "If we confront Ethan privately, he can dismiss us," Sarah said as they sat in her small parlor Saturday evening, the evidence spread across the table between them. "But if we present this in front of witnesses, in front of the people who've known him his whole life, he'll have to listen. And more importantly, the town will have to acknowledge what happened." Clara stared at the documents, the asylum records, the telegram, the letter to Ruth Coleman, all arranged in chronological order like chapters in a story she'd lived but never wanted to tell. "He'll hate me for this, for exposing him in public." "He already hates you," Sarah said bluntly, "or he thinks he does. What he'll hate more is living a lie for the rest of his life. Trust me, Clara, this is the only way." So they waited. Clara spent Saturday night unable to sleep, rehearsing what she would say, how she would present the evidence, how she would make people believe something that sounded impossible. She rose before dawn and dressed in her best, which was still just the gray cotton dress, but she'd washed and pressed it carefully, braided her hair with steady hands, tried to look like someone worthy of being believed. The church bells rang at 9 o'clock. Clara walked to the white clapboard building with Sarah beside her, drawing stares from everyone they passed. The congregation was already gathering, families in their Sunday clothes, children running between wagons, men standing in clusters smoking and talking while their wives headed inside. Clara saw Ethan immediately. He stood near the church steps with Daniel, adjusting the boy's collar while Daniel squirmed impatiently. Ethan looked up as Clara and Sarah approached, and his expression hardened into something cold and warning. "Sarah," he said carefully. "Miss Whitmore." "Ethan," Sarah replied, "we need to talk to you before the service starts. I have nothing to say to her." "Then just listen," Sarah said. "Please, 5 minutes. That's all we're asking." Daniel tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Papa, can I go play with Tommy?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Stay where I can see you." Daniel ran off toward a group of children, and Ethan turned back to Sarah and Clara with arms crossed. "You have 5 minutes. Make them count. Clara pulled the documents from her bag with hands that only trembled slightly. "I have proof," she said. "Proof of everything I told you." She handed him the asylum records first. Ethan unfolded them slowly, his eyes scanning the pages. Clara watched his face, saw confusion give way to something that might have been doubt. "These show you were committed," he said. "They don't prove Daniel is your son." "Look at the date of the birth record," Clara said quietly. "March 15th, 1886. The same day Margaret died. The same day Daniel was born." "Coincidence." "Is it?" Clara handed him the telegram next. "This is from my father to Dr. Brennan, asking about wet nurses, dated March 14th, the day before both births." Ethan read it, his face paling. "This doesn't—" "And this," Clara interrupted, giving him the letter to Ruth Coleman, "is from my father, hiring a wet nurse for a baby whose mother unfortunately died. Dated 2 weeks before either child was born, before he could possibly know Margaret would die. But he did know I was pregnant and locked away, and he was making arrangements to take my baby." Ethan's hand shook as he read the letter. Around them, people were starting to notice the confrontation, moving closer to hear. Clara saw Dorothy and Ruth Miller, Mrs. Kowalski, the sheriff, families she recognized from town. They were forming a loose circle, curious and hungry for scandal. "This is insane," Ethan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're saying your father orchestrated some elaborate scheme to steal your baby and give him to me? Why would anyone do that?" "Because I humiliated him," Clara said. "I ran away, got pregnant by a man he didn't approve of, refused the marriage he arranged. He couldn't let that stand, so he took the one thing I loved and made sure I'd never find him." "But I was there," Ethan said desperately. "I was at the house when Margaret went into labor. I waited outside while Dr. Brennan worked. I heard her screaming, heard the baby cry. I held my son within hours of his birth." "You held a baby," Clara said gently. "But was it the same baby?" Dr. Brennan's notes say the infant seemed weak at first, possibly premature. But the next day he was robust and healthy. "Don't you think that's strange?" Sheriff Dawson pushed through the crowd, his face grave. "What's going on here?" Sarah turned to him. "We have evidence, Sheriff. Evidence that Daniel Hale was stolen from Miss Whitmore and given to Ethan under false pretenses." "That's a serious accusation," the sheriff said. "It's the truth," Clara said. She handed him the documents, watching as he read through them with the careful attention of someone trained to evaluate evidence. The crowd had grown larger now. Clara could hear whispers, feel the weight of judgment and fascination pressing in from all sides. She saw Daniel in the distance, still playing, unaware that his whole world was about to shatter. "These documents show Miss Whitmore was in an asylum," the sheriff finally said. "They show she gave birth on the same day as Margaret Hale. They show Charles Whitmore made arrangements for a wet nurse, but they don't conclusively prove the baby she bore is the same child Ethan's been raising." "Then what would prove it?" Clara demanded. "What evidence would possibly be enough?" "A witness," the sheriff said. "Someone who was there, who saw what happened." "Everyone who was there is either dead or in Philadelphia," Clara said. "My father made sure of that." "Not everyone." The voice came from the edge of the crowd, thin and wavering. Mrs. Brennan stepped forward, leaning heavily on a cane, her elderly face set with determination. "My husband was there, and he left notes." The crowd parted for her. Mrs. Brennan moved slowly, each step deliberate, until she stood beside the sheriff. She looked at Clara with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. "I read through my husband's files after Sarah came asking questions," Mrs. Brennan said. "I found something I'd forgotten about. A letter my husband wrote but never sent. It was addressed to the medical board in Cheyenne, dated 6 months after Margaret Hale's death." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket with trembling hands and gave it to the sheriff. "Read it aloud," she said. "These people deserve to know." Sheriff Dawson unfolded the letter and began to read, his voice carrying across the churchyard. "To the Territorial Medical Board, I am writing to report a matter of conscience that has troubled me greatly. 6 months ago, I attended the birth and subsequent death of Margaret Hale. The child survived but appeared weak and possibly premature. I expressed concerns to the father, Ethan Hale, that the infant might not survive the night. However, when I returned the following morning to check on the child, I found him remarkably improved, So much so that I questioned whether it was the same infant. The baby appeared larger, healthier, more robust than the child I had examined the previous evening. When I mentioned this to Charles Whitmore, Esquire, who had arrived from Philadelphia ostensibly to offer his condolences and assistance, he suggested that I had been mistaken in my initial assessment, that the trauma of attending a death had clouded my medical judgment. He offered a substantial donation to the church and suggested that raising questions about the child's providence would only cause unnecessary pain to Mr. Hale. Against my better judgment, I accepted his explanation and said nothing. But the matter has weighed on my conscience. I suspect that some deception occurred, though I cannot prove it. I leave it to wiser heads to determine whether further investigation is warranted. Respectfully, Dr. James Brennan. Silence fell over the churchyard like a physical weight. Clara saw Ethan's face drain of color, saw his hands clench around the letter from Ruth Coleman, saw the moment when doubt became certainty and certainty became horror. "No," Ethan whispered. "No, that's not... It can't be. My husband never sent that letter," Mrs. Brennan said quietly. Charles Whitmore's donation built the new church steeple. The money came with an implicit understanding that certain questions wouldn't be asked. My husband was a good man, but he was also human. He chose the easy path, and it haunted him until he died. Ethan turned to Clara, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Sweetwater, she saw something other than anger in his eyes. She saw devastation, understanding, grief. "Margaret's baby," he said hoarsely. "What happened to Margaret's baby?" Mrs. Brennan's expression grew sorrowful. "The child your wife bore was stillborn, Ethan. My husband noted it in his private records, though the official death certificate only mentions Margaret. I believe Charles Whitmore arrived with another infant, Miss Whitmore's infant, and persuaded my husband to make the substitution. Margaret had died. Her baby had died. You were destroyed by grief. Accepting a healthy baby in place of a dead one probably seemed like a mercy." "A mercy," Ethan repeated and laughed bitterly. "A mercy built on lies and theft." "Built on love," Clara said quietly. "Whatever else is true, Ethan, you've loved Daniel every day of his life. You've raised him well. You've been everything a father should be. That doesn't change." "Everything changes," Ethan said. He looked at her with eyes full of anguish. "If this is true, if Daniel is your son, not mine and Margaret's, then I've been living a lie. I've been telling him stories about his mother that aren't real. I've been taking him to a grave that doesn't hold the woman who gave birth to him." "You've been loving him," Clara said. "That's real. That's the only thing that matters." "How can you say that?" Ethan's voice rose. "I took your son from you. I raised him believing you didn't exist. You didn't know," Clara interrupted. "You were used, just like I was used. Just like Ruth Coleman and Dr. Brennan were used. My father orchestrated this, Ethan, not you." Dorothy Miller pushed forward through the crowd, her face flushed with indignation. "Even if all this is true, what gives you the right to come here and tear apart a child's life? Daniel knows Ethan as his father. He's happy, secure. And you want to destroy that for what? Your own satisfaction?" "I want my son to know the truth," Clara said. "I want him to know I didn't abandon him, that I fought for 4 years to find him, that I loved him every moment we were apart." "But what about what he wants?" Ruth Miller demanded. "Has anyone asked Daniel what he wants?" All eyes turned toward the group of children still playing near the church. Daniel had stopped running and was watching the adult gathering with wide, confused eyes. He must have sensed something was wrong, must have felt the tension crackling through the air. Ethan made a sound low in his throat and started toward his son. Clara moved to follow, but Sarah caught her arm. "Let him," Sarah whispered. "Let Ethan talk to him first." They watched as Ethan knelt beside Daniel, pulling the boy into his arms. They couldn't hear what was said, but they could see Daniel's face scrunch up with worry, could see him shake his head, could see Ethan holding him tighter. Then Daniel turned and looked directly at Clara. Even from a distance, even through the crowd, Clara felt the impact of that gaze. Daniel pulled away from Ethan and started walking toward her. Ethan called after him, but the boy kept coming, weaving between adults until he stood directly in front of Clara. "Are you really my mama?" he asked, his voice high and uncertain and breaking Clara's heart. Clara knelt so they were eye to eye. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." But Papa says my mama is in heaven. Your papa's mama is in heaven, Clara said carefully, a wonderful woman named Margaret who loved him very much. But the mama who gave birth to you, who held you when you were brand new, who never stopped looking for you, that's me. Daniel's gray eyes, so like her own, searched her face. I dream about you sometimes. In my dreams, you're crying and calling my name, but I can't find you. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. I know, sweetheart. I was calling for you. For so long, I was calling and calling. Did you find me now? Yes, Clara whispered. I found you. Daniel looked back at Ethan, who stood frozen several yards away, his face stricken. Then the boy looked at Clara again. Are you going to take me away? The question stabbed through Clara like a blade. She wanted to say yes, wanted to claim him and never let go. But she looked at Ethan's devastated face, thought about the love he'd poured into this child for 5 years, and knew what she had to do. No, she said, I'm not going to take you away. Your papa, Ethan, he's been your papa since you were born. He loves you more than anything in this world. I would never take you from him. Then why did you come? Because I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to know that I didn't leave you on purpose, that I've been looking for you every single day, that I love you, even though we've been apart. Daniel processed this with the serious concentration of a child trying to understand adult complexities. Can you stay? He finally asked. Here in Sweetwater? I don't know if people want me here. I want you here, Daniel said. Then, softer. Please? Clara looked up at Ethan. He stood with his arms hanging at his sides, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, anger, grief, fear, and something that might have been resignation. He walked over slowly and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. We need to talk, he said to Clara. Really talk, not in front of the whole town. Clara nodded, standing. The crowd had grown silent, watching this drama unfold like spectators at a play. Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat. I think everyone should go on into church, he said firmly. This is a private family matter, and it doesn't need an audience. There were murmurs of protest, but the sheriff's authority held. Slowly, reluctantly, people began moving toward the church. Dorothy and Ruth Miller shot Clara looks of pure venom as they passed. Mrs. Kowalski squeezed her shoulder briefly. Mrs. Brennan nodded with something that might have been approval or absolution. When the churchyard was empty except for Clara, Ethan, Daniel, Sarah, and the sheriff, Ethan finally spoke. I don't know what to do, he said simply. I don't know how to fix this. We can't fix it, Clara said. What's done is done. But we can decide what happens next. What do you want to happen? Clara looked at Daniel, at the boy who'd called her mama, who'd dreamed of her without knowing why. I want to be part of his life. I want him to know me. I want the chance to be his mother, even if it's not in the way I imagined. And what about me? Ethan asked. Do I just disappear? Pretend I didn't raise him from birth? No, Clara said firmly. You're his father. You've earned that title 1,000 times over. I'm not trying to replace you, Ethan. I'm trying to take my place beside you. Ethan laughed bitterly. How is that supposed to work? We're strangers, Clara. We had 5 days together 5 years ago. We don't know each other. Then we learn, Clara said. For Daniel's sake, we learn how to be what he needs. Sarah stepped forward. There's legal precedent for this kind of arrangement. Shared custody, supervised visits, gradual integration. It's not traditional, but nothing about this situation is traditional. The sheriff nodded. I'd be willing to mediate, make sure everything's done proper and legal. The boy's welfare comes first. Ethan looked down at Daniel, who was watching all of them with wide, worried eyes. What do you think, son? What do you want? Daniel's lower lip trembled. I want everyone to stop being sad. The simplicity of it broke something in the air. Ethan's face crumpled, and he pulled Daniel close. I know, buddy. I know. Clara moved closer, slowly, giving Ethan space to reject her if he needed to. But he didn't pull away. He just held Daniel and let Clara stand near them, creating the fragile beginning of something that might eventually become a family. We'll start small, Ethan finally said, his voice rough. Supervised visits, an hour at a time. Sarah can be there to make sure everything's appropriate. Thank you, Clara whispered. "Don't thank me," Ethan said. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for him, because he deserves to know his mother, even if it kills me to admit she's not the woman I thought she was." The church bells rang again, calling stragglers to service. Daniel wiggled free from Ethan's embrace and looked between the two adults who'd shaped his existence in such different ways. "Can we all go to church together?" he asked hopefully. Ethan and Clara looked at each other. The idea of sitting side by side, of presenting themselves as a united front when everything was still so raw and broken, seemed impossible. But Daniel was watching them with those gray eyes that belonged to both of them, and neither could bring themselves to say no. "All right," Ethan said quietly. "We'll go together." They walked into the church as the opening hymn began, Daniel between them holding both their hands. The congregation's heads turned as they entered, whispers spreading like wildfire. But Clara kept her spine straight and her chin up, following Ethan to a pew near the back. She sat with her son beside her, feeling the solid warmth of his small body, hearing his voice as he tried to follow the hymn. On Daniel's other side, Ethan sang with a voice cracked from emotion, one hand resting on the boy's shoulder in a gesture that spoke of protection and possession and fear. The Reverend's sermon was about forgiveness and truth, and Clara wondered if he'd chosen the topic deliberately or if fate had a sense of irony. She barely heard the words. She was too focused on Daniel, on the miracle of sitting beside him, on the terrifying knowledge that everything could still fall apart. When the service ended, people rushed toward them with questions and accusations and demands for explanation. But Sheriff Dawson stepped in, creating a barrier between the mob and the fragile truce that had been established. "Give them space," he ordered. "There'll be time for questions later. Right now they need privacy to figure this out." Ethan nodded gratefully and led Daniel out a side door, Clara and Sarah following. They stood in the shade of a cottonwood tree while Daniel ran in circles, burning off the nervous energy of too much adult drama. "When do you want to start the visits?" Clara asked quietly. "Tomorrow," Ethan said. "Monday afternoon. Sarah's house. 1 hour." "I'll be there." Ethan turned to face her fully, and for the first time Clara saw something other than hostility in his expression. She saw exhaustion, confusion, and the tentative beginning of acceptance. "I need you to understand something," he said. "I loved Margaret. I grieved her. And even though I know now that Daniel isn't hers, that doesn't change what I felt, what I still feel." "I know," Clara said. "And I'm not asking you to forget her or stop loving her memory. She was real. Your love for her was real. None of that was a lie. But everything else was." "Yes," Clara admitted. "Everything else was." Ethan watched Daniel play, his expression unreadable. He's going to have questions about why this happened, who's to blame, why we can't just be a normal family. "We'll answer them together," Clara said. "Age-appropriate truth. Nothing we can't take back. And when he's older, when he wants to know all of it, then we tell him all of it," Clara said. "The good and the bad, the love and the lies, everything." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he called Daniel over. The boy came running, his face flushed from exertion and still carrying that worried expression that no 5-year-old should have to wear. "Daniel," Ethan said, kneeling so they were eye level, "you're going to start spending time with Clara, getting to know her. Is that all right with you?" Daniel looked at Clara, then back at Ethan. "Will you be there too?" "At first, yes. Miss Sarah will be there to help, but eventually you and Clara might spend time alone, just the two of you." "What should I call her?" The question hung in the air. Clara's throat closed around the word she wanted to hear, the name she'd dreamed of for 5 years. "Whatever feels right to you," Ethan said. "You don't have to decide now." Daniel nodded seriously, then walked over to Clara. He stood in front of her for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that was almost painful. Then he reached out and took her hand. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. It wasn't Mama. It wasn't love. It wasn't everything Clara had hoped for. But it was a beginning. Clara squeezed his hand gently. "I'll see you tomorrow, Daniel." Ethan collected his son and walked toward their wagon, leaving Clara and Sarah standing beneath the cottonwood tree. The churchyard had mostly emptied, people going home to their Sunday dinners and their gossip, their normal lives that hadn't been turned inside out by impossible truths. Sarah put an arm around Clara's shoulders. "You did it," she said quietly. You proved you were telling the truth. I proved it, Clara agreed. But now comes the hard part. Actually building a relationship with a child who doesn't know me. Earning Ethan's trust. Figuring out how to be a mother from the outside looking in. One day at a time, Sarah said. One visit at a time. You found him, Clara. That was the impossible part. Everything else is just details. Clara watched Ethan's wagon roll down Main Street, Daniel's small head visible beside his father's larger form. Her son was alive. Her son knew the truth. Her son had held her hand. It wasn't everything she'd dreamed of during those 4 years in the asylum, but it was real, and it was hers, and it was enough to build on. Tomorrow she would see Daniel again. Tomorrow she would take another step toward becoming part of his life. And somehow, impossibly, tomorrow would lead to the day after, and the day after that, until all those tomorrows added up to a life she'd fought for and earned and refused to surrender. Clara took a deep breath of Wyoming air, tasting dust and sage and possibility. The sun was high overhead, burning away the morning's drama, leaving only the stark truth and the uncertain future. She had found her son. Now she had to learn how to be his mother. Monday afternoon arrived with the kind of crystalline autumn clarity that made everything seem more real, more immediate. Clara stood outside Sarah's house at exactly 2 o'clock, her palms damp despite the cool air, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the lace curtains she could see movement, Sarah setting out tea things, the purposeful bustle of preparation for something momentous disguised as ordinary. The door opened before Clara could knock. Sarah stood there with an expression that was equal parts encouragement and warning. "He's already here," she said quietly. "Both of them. Daniel's nervous." "So am I," Clara admitted. "Good. That means you understand what's at stake." Sarah stepped aside, letting Clara enter the small, neat parlor. Ethan sat on the settee with Daniel pressed against his side, the boy's small hand clutching his father's shirt. Daniel looked up when Clara entered, his gray eyes wide and uncertain, and Clara's breath caught at the sight of him in proper daylight, in a space where she was welcome to be near him. "Hello, Daniel," she said softly. "Hello," he whispered back. Ethan's face was carefully neutral, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the protective way he kept one arm around Daniel. "Clara," he acknowledged. Sarah gestured to the chair across from them. "Please sit. I've made tea. Daniel, would you like some cookies?" The mention of cookies broke some of the tension. Daniel nodded eagerly, and Sarah brought over a plate of sugar cookies shaped like stars. Daniel took one carefully, his manners impeccable, and Clara wondered what else Ethan had taught him, what other small graces she'd missed. They sat in awkward silence for a moment, the adults holding teacups they didn't drink from, Daniel working his way through a cookie with intense concentration. Finally, Sarah cleared her throat. "Daniel, Miss Clara would like to get to know you. Maybe you could tell her about some of the things you like to do." Daniel looked at his father for permission. Ethan nodded, though his jaw was tight. "I like horses," Daniel said. "Papa's teaching me to ride, and I can count to 100, and I know all my letters." "That's wonderful," Clara said. "You must be very smart." "Papa says I get it from my mama." Daniel's face scrunched up with confusion as soon as the words left his mouth, as if he'd just realized the complication of having 2 mothers. Ethan's expression darkened, but Clara spoke quickly. "Your papa's right, and he's smart too, which means you got lucky twice." Daniel seemed to accept this logic. "Do you know how to read?" "I do. I love reading. Do you?" "Papa reads to me every night. Right now we're reading about King Arthur and the knights." Clara's chest tightened with longing and loss. 5 years of bedtime stories she'd never hear, 5 years of goodnight kisses she'd never give. But she pushed the grief aside and focused on the present, on the small boy watching her with cautious curiosity. "I used to love those stories when I was your age," she said. "Do you have a favorite knight?" "Sir Lancelot, because he's brave, but he makes mistakes sometimes. Papa says making mistakes is how we learn to be better." Clara glanced at Ethan and saw a flicker of something, acknowledgement maybe, or the ghost of shared understanding. "Your papa's right about that too." The conversation grew easier after that. Daniel told her about the ranch, about his favorite horse, about the time he'd found a bird with a broken wing and Ethan had helped him nurse it back to health. Clara listened, asking questions, storing away every detail like precious stones. Ethan remained mostly silent, watching their interaction with the vigilance of a guard dog. But gradually, as Daniel relaxed and began talking more freely, some of the tension left Ethan's frame. He even managed a small smile when Daniel told Clara about the time he'd accidentally let all the chickens out and it had taken hours to catch them. When Sarah's clock chimed 3, marking the end of their hour, Daniel's face fell. Already? Time moves fast when you're having fun, Sarah said gently. Daniel turned to Clara. Can you come again? If your papa says it's all right. Daniel looked up at Ethan with pleading eyes. Can she, Papa? Please. Ethan's expression was complicated, pain and resignation, and something that might have been grudging approval. Yes, he said finally. She can come again. The visits became a pattern. Monday and Thursday afternoons, 1 hour each time, always at Sarah's house with her as witness and buffer. Clara learned that Daniel was afraid of thunderstorms but loved the first snowfall, that he had a gap-toothed smile that could light up a room, that he asked 1,000 questions about everything and listened to the answers with fierce concentration. She learned that Ethan was a better father than she could have hoped for, patient, loving, attentive to Daniel's needs and moods. She watched the way they moved together, the unconscious synchronization of 5 years spent as each other's whole world, and it broke her heart even as it filled her with gratitude. But she also saw the strain. Ethan barely spoke to her beyond basic courtesies. His smiles, when they appeared, never reached his eyes. He was going through the motions, honoring an agreement, but there was no warmth in it, no forgiveness. 3 weeks into the visits, Daniel asked the question Clara had been dreading. Why didn't you come find me sooner? They were sitting on Sarah's porch, watching leaves skitter across the yard. Ethan had stepped inside for more coffee, leaving them briefly alone. Clara took a careful breath. I tried, she said honestly. From the moment they took you from me, I tried to find you. But some very powerful people didn't want us to be together. They locked me away where I couldn't look for you. Why? Because they were afraid of what would happen if I told the truth about what they'd done. Daniel processed this with his characteristic seriousness. Were you scared? Yes, Clara admitted. I was very scared, but I never stopped thinking about you. Even when I didn't know where you were, even when I thought I might never find you, I loved you every single day. Papa says love is what you do, not what you say. Clara smiled despite the ache in her chest. Your papa's a wise man, and he's right. Love is showing up, taking care of someone, being there when they need you. That's what he's done for you your whole life. But you showed up too, Daniel said. Even though it was hard, even though people were mean to you. Sarah told me some of the ladies in town say bad things about you. Clara's hands tightened on her teacup. What do you think about that? Daniel shrugged. I think they don't know the whole story. Papa says you shouldn't judge people until you know what they've been through. Your papa says a lot of smart things. He's sad a lot now, though, Daniel said quietly. Since you came. He tries to hide it, but I can tell. He goes outside at night and just stands there looking at the stars. Guilt crashed over Clara like a wave. She'd been so focused on reclaiming her place in Daniel's life that she hadn't fully considered the cost to Ethan, the man who'd loved a ghost, raised a son on foundations of lies he'd never questioned, and now had to reconcile the life he'd built with the truth that demolished it. When Ethan returned to the porch, Clara stood. Could we talk? Just the two of us? Ethan's expression grew guarded, but he nodded. He asked Sarah to watch Daniel, and then he and Clara walked toward the edge of Sarah's property, where a fence marked the boundary between town and open prairie. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the wind move through the grass. Finally, Clara spoke. I'm sorry, she said, for all of this. For the disruption, the pain, the way your life has been turned upside down. If I could have found another way... There was no other way, Ethan interrupted. I understand that now, but understanding doesn't make it easier. Daniel says you're sad. Ethan's jaw tightened. Daniel's too perceptive for his own good. He gets that from you too. Clara turned to face him. I know this is hard. I know you loved Margaret, that you built a life around her memory. And I'm not trying to erase that or diminish what you felt. But Ethan, you're still Daniel's father. Nothing changes that. Everything changes that, Ethan said harshly. He's not mine, Clara. Not biologically. Not in any way that actually matters. How can you say that? You've been his father since birth. You've raised him, loved him, shaped who he is. Biology doesn't erase 5 years of devotion. But it changes the story, Ethan said. Every time I look at him now, I see you. I see the 5 days we spent together before everything fell apart. I see the lie I've been living, and I don't know how to reconcile the son I thought I had with the truth of who he actually is. Clara's throat tightened. He's the same boy he was a month ago. The only thing that's changed is what you know, not who he is. That's easy for you to say. You didn't spend 5 years believing a lie. No, Clara said quietly. I spent 4 years locked in an asylum, being told I was insane for believing the truth. We've both suffered, Ethan. We've both been used. The question is whether we let that destroy us, or whether we find a way through it. Ethan was silent for a long moment. I don't know how to share him, he finally admitted. I don't know how to be his father while watching you become his mother. It feels like losing him by degrees. You're not losing him. You're gaining help. Someone else who loves him, who wants what's best for him, who'll stand beside you instead of trying to replace you. Clara hesitated, then added softly, We made him together, Ethan. Even if we didn't mean to, even if the circumstances were impossible. He's ours, both of ours. Maybe it's time we started acting like it. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, and Clara saw the grief and anger beginning to crack, making room for something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it. I'll think about it, he said finally. It wasn't much, but it was more than Clara had hoped for. The following Thursday, Ethan arrived at Sarah's house with Daniel and a proposition. There's a winter festival in town Saturday. Games, food, music. Daniel wants to go, and I thought... He paused, clearly uncomfortable. I thought maybe we could all go, together. Clara's heart leaped. You mean that? I mean, we'll try it. See how it goes. No promises beyond Saturday. I'll take it, Clara said. Saturday dawned cold and bright, the first real taste of winter sharp in the air. Clara dressed carefully, braiding her hair and wearing her best shawl, knowing that appearing in public with Ethan and Daniel would invite scrutiny and gossip. But when she met them on Main Street, Daniel's face lit up with such uncomplicated joy that she knew it was worth whatever whispers would follow. The festival was exactly what a small-town celebration should be. Apple bobbing for the children, pie contests for the adults, a fiddler playing lively tunes while couples danced in the street. Daniel dragged them from booth to booth, his enthusiasm infectious, his laughter ringing out across the square. People stared. Clara felt their eyes, heard the whispers that followed in their wake. But Ethan stayed close, a solid presence at her side, and his willingness to be seen with her was its own kind of declaration. At the ring toss booth, Daniel begged Ethan to try for the large stuffed bear. Ethan paid his nickel and proceeded to miss spectacularly on all 3 throws. Daniel's face fell with disappointment, and before Clara could think better of it, she stepped forward. May I try? Ethan looked surprised but handed over another nickel. Clara took the rings, remembering carnival games from her childhood, and sent the first one sailing perfectly onto the farthest peg. The second and third followed, and suddenly the booth operator was handing her the enormous bear. She knelt and presented it to Daniel with a small bow. For you, Sir Knight. Daniel's squeal of delight drew smiles from the crowd. He hugged the bear, then impulsively threw his arms around Clara's neck. Thank you, Mama. The word hung in the air like a prayer answered. Clara's vision blurred with tears as she held him, feeling his small body pressed against hers, hearing the name she dreamed of for 5 years, finally spoken with joy instead of confusion. When she looked up, Ethan was watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read, but there was something softer in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, eating roasted chestnuts, watching the pie judging, listening to the fiddler. Daniel walked between them, sometimes holding Clara's hand, sometimes Ethan's, sometimes linking them both together like a bridge. As the sun began to set and lanterns were lit throughout the square, the fiddlers struck up a waltz. Couples moved into the street, swaying together in the gathering darkness. Daniel tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Dance with her, Papa," he said, pointing at Clara. Ethan's eyes widened. "Daniel, I don't think—" "Please, just one dance?" Clara started to demur, to save Ethan from the awkwardness, but he surprised her by holding out his hand. "One dance," he said quietly. She took his hand and let him lead her into the circle of dancers. His other hand settled at her waist, careful and proper, and they began to move together. It was the first time they'd touched since that night 5 years ago, and Clara was acutely aware of his warmth, his strength, the way their bodies remembered how to move together, even though their hearts were still learning. "Thank you for today," Clara said softly, "for giving this a chance." "Daniel wanted it," Ethan said. "I'm doing it for him." "I know, but still, thank you." They danced in silence for a moment, the music washing over them, the other couples spinning past. Then Ethan spoke again. "He called you Mama." "I heard." "Did you ask him to?" "No, I would never—" "I know," Ethan interrupted. "I know you wouldn't. But Clara, when he says that, when he calls you Mama, it makes Margaret feel further away, like she's being erased." Clara's chest tightened. "She's not being erased. She was real and important and part of your life. But Ethan, she wasn't Daniel's mother. I was. I am. And as much as I respect what you felt for her, Daniel deserves to have a living mother, not just a memory of someone else's." Ethan's grip on her hand tightened. "I know. I do know that. It's just—" His voice cracked slightly. "It's hard to let go of the story I told myself. The story where Margaret and I built something beautiful together, where Daniel was our legacy. Now I have to tell a different story, and I don't know how." "Then we write it together," Clara said. "A story where two people who barely knew each other created something precious, where tragedy and lies tried to destroy what should have been, but love found a way through anyway. Where a child gets to have both parents, not because it's simple or easy, but because it's right." The music ended. They stood in the middle of the street, still holding each other, while around them couples separated and applauded the fiddler. Daniel came running up, the bear dragging behind him. "That was pretty," he announced. "You looked like a real family." Ethan and Clara looked at each other over their son's head. Something passed between them. Not romance, not the spark of what they'd briefly shared 5 years ago, but something different. Understanding, maybe, or the beginning of partnership. "We are a family," Ethan said slowly. "Maybe not the kind people expect, but a family nonetheless." The weeks that followed brought their own challenges. Clara moved out of Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house and rented a small cottage on the edge of town, close enough to be available but far enough to give everyone space. The visits with Daniel expanded, 2 hours instead of 1, then afternoons that stretched into early evening, then entire Saturdays where Clara and Daniel would bake cookies or read stories or take walks while Ethan worked the ranch. The town slowly adjusted to the new reality. Some people, like Dorothy and Ruth Miller, never fully accepted Clara's presence, but others, like Mrs. Chen and Sheriff Dawson, treated her with respect. Mrs. Kowalski even admitted, in her gruff way, that Clara had shown more backbone than most women would have managed. Sarah remained Clara's steadfast friend and advocate, the one who'd taken the greatest risk to help uncover the truth. Without her, Clara knew none of this would have been possible, but the most surprising development came from Ethan. As the holidays approached, he began inviting Clara to the ranch, first for brief visits, then for Sunday dinners, then for ordinary evenings where they'd sit by the fire while Daniel played. They talked, slowly and carefully, about everything that had happened. Ethan shared memories of those early days with Daniel, the sleepless nights and small triumphs that Clara had missed. Clara told him about the asylum, about the darkness she'd survived, about the hope that had kept her alive. They were building something neither had planned for, not romance, but respect, trust, the foundation of co-parenting and shared purpose. One evening in December, after Daniel had gone to bed, Ethan and Clara sat on the porch watching snow fall across the prairie. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer weighted with anger or grief. "I got a letter from Philadelphia," Clara said quietly. From a lawyer. My father died 3 weeks ago. Ethan looked at her sharply. How do you feel about that? Clara considered the question. Relieved, mostly. He can't hurt me anymore. Can't try to take Daniel away or claim I'm insane. It's over. Does that mean you'll go back east? Claim your inheritance? There is no inheritance. He left everything to charity, specifically to ensure I'd get nothing. But I don't need his money. Clara looked at the snow, at the land that had become her home. Everything I want is here. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Daniel asked me yesterday if you were going to stay forever. What did you tell him? I told him that was up to you, but Clara... Ethan turned to face her. If you did want to stay permanently, there's something I've been thinking about. Clara's heart quickened. What? This arrangement we have, it works. Daniel's happy, thriving even. But it's also complicated. People talk. Wonder about the propriety of a single woman spending so much time with a widower and his son. And legally, you have no rights. If something happened to me, you'd have no claim to Daniel. What are you suggesting? Ethan took a deep breath. I'm suggesting we make it legal, not a love match. Neither of us is pretending that's what this is, but a partnership. A marriage of convenience that gives you legal rights to Daniel and gives him the security of having both parents under one roof. Clara's breath caught. Ethan, you don't have to... I'm not doing it out of obligation, Ethan interrupted. I'm doing it because it makes sense. Because I've watched you with Daniel these past months, seen how much you love him, how hard you've worked to earn a place in his life. You're a good mother, Clara. And more than that, you're someone I've come to respect. Someone I could see building a life with, even if it's not the life either of us imagined. Tears blurred Clara's vision. Are you sure? Because once we do this, there's no going back. We'd be tied together for as long as Daniel needs us. I'm sure, Ethan said. Daniel needs both of us. And maybe we need each other too. Not in the way songs and stories talk about, but in the way real people do. Someone to share the burden, to make decisions with, to not be alone. Clara thought about the cottage that had never quite felt like home, about the loneliness of being Daniel's mother, but not being able to tuck him in at night, about the future stretching ahead with visits and schedules instead of family. Then she thought about what Ethan was offering, not romance, but something possibly more valuable. Partnership. Permanence. Home. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. They were married in January, in a quiet ceremony with only Sarah, Sheriff Dawson, and Daniel as witnesses. Daniel was thrilled, though he understood it in the simple terms of a 5-year-old. Mama was moving in, they'd all be together, everything would be better. Clara moved to the ranch on a cold, clear morning, her few possessions fitting in a single wagon. Ethan had prepared a room for her, not his room, they'd agreed, but a space of her own until and unless they decided otherwise. It was enough. The first months were an adjustment, learning to live together, to navigate the domestic intimacy of shared meals and morning routines, to parent together instead of in shifts. They argued sometimes about discipline or schedules or the 100 small decisions that came with raising a child, but they also learned to compromise, to listen, to value each other's perspective. And slowly, something unexpected began to grow. Not the wild passion of their 5 days in Cheyenne, but something steadier. Affection. Care. The kind of love that came from choosing someone every day, from building a life together piece by piece. One night in early spring, Clara woke to find her bed empty and the house quiet. She rose and found Ethan standing on the porch, looking at the stars the way Daniel had described months ago. "Can't sleep?" she asked, joining him. "Just thinking," Ethan said, "about how strange life is. How the worst thing that ever happened to me, losing Margaret, being lied to about Daniel, led to something I never expected." "What's that?" He looked at her, and in the starlight, his expression was soft and open. "You. This. A second chance at something real." Clara's throat tightened. "I never thought I'd have this either. A home. A family. Someone who knows the truth and stays anyway." "Is this enough for you?" Ethan asked quietly. "This life, or do you wish things were different?" Clara considered the question honestly. Did she wish she'd never been taken from Daniel, never suffered 4 years in an asylum, never lost the early years of her son's life? Of course. But would she trade where she'd ended up? This ranch, this man, this hard-won peace? I wouldn't change it, she said finally. Not if changing it meant losing this. Ethan reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. It was the first gesture of affection he'd initiated, and Clara's heart swelled with hope. Neither would I, he said. They stood together in the darkness, watching the stars wheel overhead, and Clara understood that this was what healing looked like. Not forgetting the past, but building something strong enough to carry its weight. Not erasing the pain, but transforming it into something with purpose. Inside, Daniel slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that both his parents were under the same roof, that the nightmares of separation were over, that he was loved beyond measure. And out on the porch, two people who'd been brought together by tragedy and lies began the slow, careful process of choosing each other. Not because fate demanded it, not because passion swept them away, but because they'd both learned that the strongest foundations were built on truth, respect, and the daily decision to show up and try. Years later, when Daniel was grown and starting his own family, he would ask Clara to tell him the story of how she found him. She would tell him everything: the asylum, the lies, the desperate search, the moment she'd stepped off the train and heard him call her mama. She would tell him about Ethan's grief and anger, about Sarah's courage, about the evidence that had set them all free. But she would also tell him about what came after, about choosing to build instead of destroy, about learning that family wasn't just biology or romance, but commitment and work and grace. And Daniel would understand because he'd grown up watching his parents turn a broken beginning into something whole. He'd seen them argue and compromise and choose each other every single day. He'd learned that love wasn't always simple or easy, but it was always worth fighting for. Clara never forgot what she'd lost. Those stolen years, that suffering, the price paid for her father's cruelty. But she also never let it define her. She'd come to Sweetwater with nothing but a letter and a dream. She'd stayed through rejection and suspicion and pain. And in the end, she'd found everything she'd been searching for. Not rescue, not vindication, not even justice, really. Just home, family, belonging. The things that mattered most, the things worth crossing mountains to find.